Coming up, quote, "Those who fail to learn from history are condemned to repeat it," close quote. Welcome back to Political Spirits. I'm your host, Franklin Rye. We still stand for the proposition that the left and the right should have a few drinks and talk. Compromise is not a requirement. If those discussions result in us changing or even abandoning our positions, that's fine. If they don't, that's fine too. We just need to talk to each other. In that way, we can unify through speech. And if the discussion becomes a bit heated at the end of the night, we should still be able to split up the bar tab and be on our way. So what are we going to talk about this week? Well, it's good to be back home. I did have a lot of fun on my extended road trip, but it was certainly challenging to try to record podcast episodes on the road instead of in my studio, and I have to apologize for the resulting lack of sound quality for the last two episodes, especially the one last week. There was quite a bit of interference from electronic devices in the room I was in, and I just didn't have time to solve the problem. But thankfully, I'm back in the studio, so sound quality problem solved. Let's start this segment with the quote that I know you've heard, at least one of the variations of it. Perhaps the most famous version comes from Winston Churchill, who said, quote, "Those who fail to learn from history are condemned to repeat it," close quote. Perhaps the first usage, though, was from George Santayana in 1905, quote, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it," close quote. I'm going to talk about the latest instance of a failure to learn from history and how a state far from my home is making that mistake and the terrifying lesson it should have learned. As I've talked about before, the final straw, so to speak, the deciding factor that pushed me to stop delaying and start a podcast was the way in which the media reacted to the Marjory Stoneman Douglas school shooting. And remember, two of my kids were there. They weren't physically injured. Our family was one of the lucky ones. I was furious with the media because rather than conducting themselves as investigative journalists, they essentially reached into a drawer and pulled out their standard story claiming that the mass shooting was the result of the failure to pass gun control legislation. CNN in particular turned it into a political event. I was disgusted. I was fed up. I was furious. And when it slowly came out just how far from the actual truth CNN and the rest of the media had been, I was determined to start a podcast right away, and I started buying the equipment. The evil, deeply disturbed individual who conducted the shooting and whose name I will not mention is, of course, responsible for it. But the failure to prevent the shooting or stop it in progress was the result of a seemingly endless string of government failures. If you're interested in all the details regarding those failures that led to the shooting and the failure to stop it in progress, I highly recommend Andrew Pollack's book, Why Meadow Died. Meadow was his daughter who was savagely gunned down that day. I'm not going to go into all of those details regarding the government failures because I talked about many of them on prior episodes. And my intent in this episode is to address the failed policy being adopted in a Western state that is shockingly close to one of the core policies which led to the Stoneman tragedy. But first, the biggest government failure that happened at the time of the shooting itself was the refusal of the first 8 Broward County Sheriff's deputies who arrived at the school to enter the building and engage the shooter. They hid behind cars and in building breezeways with their guns pointed at the building where the shooting was occurring as if somehow they were going to subdue an active shooter by firing at concrete. Some of them drove away and took up distant positions on roadways, asserting they were acting as snipers. This occurred while they could still hear the shots coming from within the building as one kid after another was shot and killed. The conduct of those deputies was sadly perhaps what could be expected given the incompetence of then Sheriff Scott Israel, under whom the requirement to engage an active shooter, a lesson learned all the way back in the aftermath of the Columbine shooting, was dropped. The policy at the Broward Sheriff's Office was changed from shall engage the active shooter to may engage the active shooter. And Sheriff Israel wasn't very fond of training either. In fact, his officers received a tiny fraction of the active shooter training received by the police in the neighboring Coral Springs Police Department. But the recent developments far from my home state that show a failure to learn the lessons of history, it doesn't involve active shooter training or a requirement to engage an active shooter. It involves the program which helped make it possible for the Stoneman Douglas shooter to pass through the system without being arrested, without being focused on by the criminal justice system. If the criminal justice system had focused on the shooter in the years before that horrific day, Valentine's Day 2018, his actions might have been obstructed. He might have been arrested and thereby ended up in the background check system and prevented from purchasing a gun. So how exactly could a student with an extensive history of violence and threats of violence on school premises manage to avoid being arrested, manage to stay out of the criminal justice system? That was possible because of the Promise program, which was the result of collaboration between the school district and its superintendent of schools, Robert Runcie, then Sheriff Scott Israel, and the state's attorney and the public defender. In the finest traditions of seriously misguided government programs cloaked with the deceptively positive acronyms which are the dominant dialect of government bureaucrats, Promise stood for Preventing Recidivism through Opportunities, Mentoring, Interventions, Supports, and Education. The effect of the program was to incentivize police for not arresting students. The Broward Sheriff's Office, under then-Sheriff Scott Israel, extended the policy outside of schools as well. The resultant lack of arrests was touted as a reduction in teenage crime. The claim, repeated ad nauseum by the school district, was an almost 70% reduction in school-based arrest and a 90% non-recidivism rate. How was that achieved? Well, by having a policy of not arresting students. Schools even prevented police from coming on campus to make an arrest for off-campus crimes. That's what you do when the goal is to keep the arrest numbers down rather than focusing on reducing crime. And the non-recidivism rate? As revealed in Why Meadow Died, by zeroing out violent conduct in prior school years, students could be treated as perfect on paper even with 52 violations during their time in high school. So where do I see the mistakes of the Promise program manifesting themselves again? Where did I recently see that failure to learn the lessons of history? In Colorado, where a bill is working its way through the legislature with the support of the governor in which would immunize students in high school and below from arrest, including preventing them from being arrested for actual major crimes such as violent physical assault, sexual battery, and street gang recruitment, among others. Think I'm exaggerating? Check out this actual verbiage from the bill. Quote, "A school resource officer or other law enforcement officer shall not arrest a student of the school or issue a summons, ticket, or other notice requiring the appearance of a student of the school in court or at a police station for investigation for conduct that constitutes any of the following offenses allegedly committed on the school's grounds, in a school vehicle, or at a school activity or sanctioned event." Close quote. So what exactly are the criminal acts on a high school campus for which the bill would prevent officers from arresting a student? As trial lawyer and radio host Dan Kaplis points out in his article on April 2 in the Denver Post entitled, "Kaplis, Colorado is poised to legalize crime in schools with school disciplinary legislation. The covered offenses include basically every misdemeanor crime in the Colorado Criminal Code, quote, including violent crimes that cause bodily injury and sexual crimes such as grabbing or fondling a student or teacher's private parts. Only those crimes that inflict, quote, serious bodily injury, close quote, basically broken bones and worse, are still enforceable, close quote." He points out that the violent assault for which the Boulder mass shooter was convicted when in high school would be covered by the bill. The student who went on to become the shooter pummeled a classmate without provocation and beat him ceaselessly until, quote, "police found the victim bleeding from his nose and mouth and throwing up with his right eye swollen shut," close quote. As Kaplis points out, quote, "Alyssa was charged with third-degree assault," close quote, and under the bill, quote, "police would be prohibited from arresting or even giving a ticket to students who commit third-degree assault against classmates, teachers, and others," close quote. There are few things that infuriate me more than government bureaucrats contending they've solved problems or improved statistics when all they really did was define away the problem. Have too much of something, such as crime, for example, just prohibit arrests and thereby contend the crimes never occurred. After all, it's far too difficult to do the hard work of actually reducing criminal conduct. It's much simpler to simply prohibit the arrests, use some catchy phrases like ending the school-to-prison pipeline that the media will gobble up, and you're golden. And who are the victims? The students and teachers who are targeted when crime comes with no consequences for the perpetrator. And it's not just those student victims who suffer. All students suffer because crime detracts from the purpose of schooling. Students living in fear are hard-pressed to be students, are hard-pressed to learn. And it's our entire society that will suffer the consequences when we fail to learn the lessons of history. Next topic. Sneetches, Vermont Style. Let's talk for a moment about the extent to which we've gone backwards as a country. Countries are supposed to move forward, to progress, to improve. But frankly, in many respects, we're going in the opposite direction. Some of the instances where we've regressed have been so bizarre, so inexplicable, so contrary to every lesson we should have learned over the last 50 years that I've used that old phrase from a feature that used to appear in Sports Illustrated magazine when something bizarre or unexplainable would happen in the world of sports. The magazine would describe it in a column entitled, "This Week's Sign the Apocalypse is Upon Us." Well, what was this week's sign the apocalypse is upon us? I have to say there's quite a few stories to choose from, but I'm going to focus on one in particular. Now, we should all be able to agree that the state of Vermont is often the source of some pretty left-wing policies and statements. It is, after all, the home of Socialist Senator Bernie Sanders. But the latest extreme left-wing policy, the latest modern example of policy lunacy, didn't come from a socialist. It didn't come from a Democrat. It came from the Republican governor of Vermont, Phil Scott. You may have heard about this. Multiple states are expanding eligibility for the COVID vaccine, including some states declaring persons as young as 16 to be eligible. 20 states are offering vaccines to 16-year-olds, and this week 18 more states will join them. Not included in that list is Vermont, because Vermont isn't offering the vaccine to all 16-year-old residents in the state. Vermont has chosen to exclude one group of 16-year-olds from eligibility. You're probably thinking they excluded healthy 16-year-olds, right? That would make sense. Perhaps they concluded that not enough older people and people with serious health issues have been vaccinated, so they're going to exclude young, healthy people for the moment. No, that's not it at all. Vermont did something so bizarre that if not for the crazy times in which we live, I wouldn't otherwise have believed it. So what did they do? Did they exclude 16-year-olds if they're Republicans? No, even Vermont wouldn't try that, I think. And besides, the governor of Vermont is a Republican, so presumably he wouldn't support vaccinating only Democrats. But given the decision his administration made, and which he announced and supports, I'm not sure there's anything crazy enough for him to refuse to support. So what did he do? What group of 16-year-old Vermonters did the state say are not eligible for the vaccine? White people. The state of Vermont decided that white 16-year-olds are not eligible. Well, actually, white 16-year-olds are eligible if they happen to live with a black, indigenous, or person of color, a BIPOC. The Republican governor, Phil Scott, proudly pronounced that, quote, "If you or anyone in your household identifies as black, indigenous, or a person of color, BIPOC, including anyone with Abenaki or First Nations heritage, all household members who are 16 years or older can sign up to get the vaccine," close quote. By the way, he ended that with an exclamation point. We used to understand the appropriate word to describe such a policy: racist, or illegal, unconstitutional, immoral. But that was before our supposed betters in the media, academia, and much of the political class started pretending that racism can only go in one direction, that it can't be racism if the racism is directed at whites. Huge numbers of Americans know better, but they're not the ones with the bullhorns, with the cable news shows on CNN or MSNBC or the three legacy networks or newspapers, with the professorships or membership among the Hollywood elite, or benefiting from the undeserved respect some of us direct at government bureaucrats. We used to understand that such a policy was racist before the country went insane. And take a look at the language used by the administration. It didn't say, if you or anyone in your household is black, indigenous, or a person of color. It said, quote, if you or anyone in your household identifies as black, indigenous, or a person of color, close quote. Think about that. There have been endless debates about transgenderism, and I've certainly talked quite a bit about the transgender athletics issue. So we've all been exposed to the concept of identifying as a particular gender and whether and to what extent that should be accepted and what exactly that means in terms of public policies. But have any of us been exposed to the concept of identifying as a particular race? Do you remember Rachel Dolezal, the former white NAACP chapter president who claimed that she was black? She had treated her hair and appeared to have used some sort of self-tanning treatment to look more black because, as I noted in an earlier podcast episode, when she was young, she was so white she looked like an Irish waif in a Cranberries music video. And she's not the only white person to falsely claim to be black, apparently to gain some advantage organizational leadership-wise or financially. Dolezal was always laughed at and mocked, but apparently the Republican governor of Vermont is so determined to burnish his woke credentials that he's willing to bring back, with the credibility gained from acceptance by a state executive branch, the concept of identifying as a particular race rather than relying on whether an individual is a member of a particular race. So what does this mean? In Vermont, can a 16-year-old white person simply claim to be black and then assert eligibility to take the vaccine themselves and thereby gain eligibility for all members of their household? If that's true, how many people who aren't black or Native American or Hispanic will claim that they identify as such to gain eligibility for the vaccine for themselves and the other members of their household? Where is this going? If the idea that you determine your race by declaring the race with which you identify, and that becomes legally accepted, won't that effectively destroy all affirmative action programs and diversity programs? With such incentives to declare yourself a minority, couldn't minorities very quickly become the majority? Not because of an actual change in demographics, but rather because false declaration by large numbers of white people regarding the races to which they identify. Do you remember the Dr. Seuss story called Sneetches? I do. I remember them from before the left labeled Dr. Seuss as a racist. The Sneetches was intended to teach children about discrimination. It was intended to teach them about how nonsensical racism was, that it made no sense to discriminate against people based on things such as color of their skin. Although in the case of the Sneetches story, it was all about whether you had a star on your belly. As Seuss noted, quote, because they had stars, all the star-belly Sneetches would brag, quote, we're the best kind of Sneetch on the beaches. With their snoots in the air, they would sniff and they'd snort. We'll have nothing to do with that plain belly sort. And whenever they met some, when they were out walking, they'd hike right on past them without even talking, close quote. Then someone put together a machine to put stars on the bellies of Sneetches that had none, provided he was paid for doing so. And when the star-belly Sneetches saw others with the stars, then stars were apparently no longer cool to them, and the enterprising businessman then charged them to remove their stars. Eventually, Sneetches became so mixed up as to who originally had stars and who didn't, that eventually, quote, they decided it's Sneetches are Sneetches, and no kind of Sneetch is best on the beaches, close quote. So is that what the governor of Vermont's ridiculous announcement portends? That we'll reach a point where race is irrelevant because people are simply announcing how they identify, perhaps doing so based on desired government benefits? Doubtful, especially if the announcement of identification didn't come with a decision to disproportionately support Democrats. But I suppose you never know. But one thing I know, and you know, is that I'll be back next week with another episode of Political Spirits. Please be sure to listen and tell your friends to do so as well, and like the podcast on Facebook at Political Spirits, and follow me and the podcast on Twitter at Franklin Rye. And remember, all episodes are now on YouTube as well, and the YouTube channel is named Political Spirits Network. If you're watching on YouTube, be sure to like and subscribe and hit the notification bell, and select all after you hit the bell. This is Franklin Rye. Thank you for listening.